I'm Lisa Stone. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Parenting Aces.
Welcome to the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Stone, and I'm so excited to have you back with us or with us for the first time this week as we get into chatting about what we have to learn from great coaches through sporting history. And we have with us this week Chris Trieste, who has written a new book. But before I get into that, I want to just tell you all a little bit about what went on over the weekend for me. I had the opportunity to attend and be a presenter of sorts at the Society for Tennis Medicine and Science, STMS, conference in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and what an amazing experience. Not only did I get to connect with some people that I've only connected with via social media or on the phone or email, but I also got to meet lots and lots of new folks, many of whom you may see or hear, as the case may be, on the Parenting Aces podcast in the near future. So I wanted to just thank Dr. Niru Jayanthi, who listeners of this show are very familiar with. Dr. J's been a guest on our podcast many, many times. But Niru is the organizer of the conference, the STMS conference. He is the head of STMS right now and is doing an incredible job of making sure that those in the medical profession who deal with the treatment of tennis injuries are up to date on all the latest research and technology available to them, and then sharing that information not only with the medical community, but also with parents and coaches. So thank you to Niru. I loved being part of the conference and hope you'll invite me back again. So that said, what about this week's guest? Well, as I mentioned, Chris Trieste has a new book out. It's called 14 Great Coaches, Learn Their Lessons, Improve Your Coaching, Have a Lasting Impact. And Chris is a former college player, so he knows what he's talking about when it comes to tennis. He has done a ton of research and talked to many, many different coaches. He chose 14 of them to feature in his book, and he's going to talk to us this week about what he learned and how we can use what he learned to do a better job both as tennis parents and coaches. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's podcast with Chris Trieste.
Chris Trieste, thank you so much for joining us on the Parenting Aces podcast. I'm thrilled to have you.
Oh, thank you very much, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be on, and thank you for having me.
Well, I have to just kind of share with the audience the way you and I kind of connected was that you sent me an email and you have a book out, and I won't say new because by the time this airs, I'm not sure how new it is, but it was chosen as one of the recommended books by Changing the Game Project, and my audience hopefully is familiar with Changing the Game Project since I've had John on the show several times and I share his articles and information all the time on our Facebook and Twitter feeds. But I was just so thrilled to hear from you, and I have such respect for John and the fact that he singled out you and your new book is just thrilling. So congratulations on that.
You know, Lisa, that was very exciting news. He at some point sent an email congratulating those authors whose books made the list, and I was happy to see I was one of them. So it was one day I just, you open your email, you don't know sometimes what you'll see, and but that was a very nice email to receive.
Well, great. And so before we jump into your book, 14 Great Coaches, I want to just give you an opportunity to share with my audience your life in tennis, your background in tennis, and then hopefully that will give everyone a little bit more insight as to why we're having our conversation today.
Sure. Excellent, Lisa. I guess I'll start from the beginning, which would make sense. I started playing tennis relatively later than a lot of other people who play high school and then college tennis, but I was probably about 12 or 13 years old when I began, and I really don't know. I started in a public parks program, just a town recreation program that had tennis lessons in the summer. It was about the time when John McEnroe and Jimmy Connors and Martina Navratilova were popular, and they were appealing as players. And I guess watching some of it on TV piqued my interest, and I signed up for these lessons and started playing. Like I said, just before high school, but really took to it and liked it, and played 4 years of high school tennis and then 4 years of college tennis at Marist College, which is in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is not too far from where I'm from. I'm from the Hudson Valley, New York region. And after that, I took a little break, but never a total break from tennis. But I started my full-time career as an educator for a little bit over 20 years. My full-time profession has been in education, where I started as a physical education teacher and then went into school administration, where I've held positions such as assistant principal, director of athletics, and now I'm a coordinator of physical education and health at a district in New York. But I've had kind of parallel type careers. I did coach. I did maintain my interest in tennis, as I mentioned. And along the way, I coached high school tennis. I coached for a while at private clubs. And then for 6 years, I coached at Mount St. Mary College, I was the men's tennis coach, which is in Newburgh, New York, Division III school, small Division III school in Newburgh, New York, where we, like I said, I coached for 6 years there. I had the good fortune to twice be named the conference coach of the year for men's tennis. And in my last year, we won the conference championship, which was the first in men's tennis for the school. And it was around that time that my kids were kind of getting involved in youth sports. So felt like I was being pulled in multiple directions. So having a physical education background and an athletic interest, I was involved with youth sports for about 10 years and multiple sports at that, sometimes as the head coach, sometimes as an assistant coach, sometimes simply as a sports parent and chauffeur. So that combined with my profession, of course, took a lot of time. And at that point, as the youth coaching kind of took a larger role, tennis kind of took a back seat. But now for the last couple of years, for about the last 3 years, I've been increasing my role again in tennis a little bit. And I've been doing private lessons and small group lessons at a club called Match Point Tennis, which is also in the Hudson Valley, where we have where it ranges from high school, very good high school players to adults of various ability levels.
Fantastic. So do you consider yourself a developmental coach, or do you consider yourself, how do you kind of frame your coaching area of expertise?
Yeah, I would say a developmental coach. The tennis players that we're working with now are they're pretty serious high school players. Some of them aspire to play in college. Realistically, most likely Division II or Division III level. But in this area, they're good high school players. They have a high level of interest. They're competitive. They're very coachable. So it's a lot of fun working with them. We do certainly refine their technique and their fundamentals, but a lot of it is strategy. A considerable amount of time we're integrating the mental game into the program, and making wise choices and strategic choices as a point develops. Like some things that when to go cross court, when to go down the line, when to be more aggressive, when to hit more of a neutral ball. Those types of things, it just seems to be themes and concepts that we're focused on pretty often. And when to come to the net, that's kind of a favorite of mine, especially as I mentioned before, somebody who kind of came into tennis in the 1980s when the serve and volley game and taking the net was more prevalent than it is now. I happen to be left-handed, so if you get me on the court with a lefty who's got somewhat of an aggressive mindset, I'll have a really good time with them.
That's awesome. I'm a lefty also. But
excellent.
Unfortunately, I never really learned all those, things that make right-handed players go nuts when they're on the court with me. So,
Lisa, yeah. So
I'm
if
still
you,
working on it.
I am not, actually, I say with some pride, I'm not ashamed to say it. I get a lot of free points off of people who are really probably better than me, serving that lefty serve into the ad side. I really did.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of mileage at it, and it didn't even matter that they knew it was coming. And then, maybe 20-30% of the time you serve it down the middle or at the body, and just to keep them a little bit on their toes, but you could just pound away at that ad side out wide.
Yeah.
And, get a lot of points and come right up to it, get up to the net right behind that. And you got some points that are over in short order.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump into your book, Chris, because that's the reason you're here today is to talk about this book and to really kind of delve into this idea of coaching as more of a general profession that encompasses lessons that can be applied to all different sports, not just the particular sport that the coach happens to work in. And so for your book, you looked at 14 different coaches from different sports. And I'm really curious what you were looking for as you chose the coaches to focus on in your book, 14 Great Coaches.
So the book, 14 Great Coaches, Learn Their Lessons, Improve Your Coaching, Have a Lasting Impact. That's the full title. And it kind of, I started the book, I don't know when I started, but back a couple of years ago, and I just started putting some ideas on paper, and it was sort of combination of ideas and concepts I was drawing from my different roles, and one as a teacher / coach in the education world, and another hat kind of as a sports parent, and then you had the youth coaching angle, and then the tennis angle. But I started to see some things that made sense and were kind of universal and fit in nicely, maybe with some modifications, but fit in nicely in all of those environments. So I started putting some ideas down on paper. And then, but it still didn't have a real framework with it yet. But one of my hobbies, I guess, you call it a hobby, is I do love to read about different coaches and successful people. And so I started reading about John Wooden from college basketball, and Joe Torre, the New York Yankees manager, and Nick Bollettieri from tennis, and then Bill Walsh from football. And I started to find some commonalities and just maybe with a little bit of changes, but they start to look a little bit like some of the things that I kind of advocated and I kind of thought was successful. So there's kind of a merging of some of my ideas and reshaping some of my ideas and kind of fitting them in and like I said, matching them up with some things that people with much more greater resumes than I have, things that they believed and things that helped them to become successful. So the book focuses on 14 coaches, 14 great coaches, and there's 60 principles that kind of make up the book. And yeah, as you said, they're coaches from different sports, various sports. They're men, they're women, they're current coaches, they're coaches from not too long ago, maybe a generation ago, and then there are a couple of coaches from 2-3 generations ago that are cited in the book. So it's kind of a combination of, again, what I like to say, universal principles, drawn somewhat from my experience, but really shaped by people who are all-time greats. And there are 60 in there, but they're I like to talk about a lot of them, but there's one that comes to mind that applies to any sport, and whether it's a youth sport atmosphere, team tennis atmosphere, individual tennis environment, high school, college. But I'll give you one off the top of my head. The carrot is better than the stick, and that's a principle that comes from John Wooden, who won 10 NCAA basketball championships in 12 years at UCLA. And he was very
my
much
alma mater.
Your alma mater.
Bruins.
Okay, awesome.
Yes,
Okay,
so yep.
if I could do some time travel and change a few things, I would love to say that was my alma mater, but just the location of it and the weather and the history. Oh boy, but the carrot is better than the stick. So he always preferred to appeal to someone's sense of pride to help motivate them and their desire to be better, as opposed to beating them over the head with a stick, proverbially. So again, he tried to appeal to their sense to become better and to want to please the coach and to want to push themselves, as opposed to kind of, using intimidation. So that was one. And again, that can apply to any sport and any age and all sorts of environments. And that's not to say that you can't, be tough, or you can't really be a little bit harsh at times on someone. But, whenever possible, he preferred the carrot over the stick.
Yeah, that's a great one. And, one of my favorite stories about him is the fact that he used to make his team sit down together before practice or before a game, and they all had to tie their shoes together.
You love that story? Yes.
Yeah, I do. When I first heard that, I was like, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. But then when I really delved deeper into it, the whole idea that everything starts with your feet. If your feet are not able to perform at their highest level, then nothing else can work either. It's the kinetic chain, right? Your feet are the thing that come in contact with the ground. And so if your shoes aren't laced up properly, your socks aren't aligned properly, you don't have the support that you need, then everything else goes downhill quickly.
Correct. And you get blisters and you have pain in your feet, and you can't perform at the level you hope to perform at. Absolutely. I love that story. I also read in a similar fashion, at least the published reason he didn't want his players having long hair. It could have been cultural too, but the reason that I had read was that if that hair is flopping all around and the sweat all over the place, and who knows, you may have to push your hair out of your eyes at some critical time and you miss a pass, or you can't see something that you need to see that kind of moves very quickly on the court. So, it's funny. But it's all true, right? It's all, there's a point to it, a real logical point to it that affects performance.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's amazing. He was something else. And there's a lot of books that he wrote or written about him, but there's, so much you could learn. And another one, here's another one that applies to tennis, to baseball, to basketball, to again, all different age levels. And it's hard to believe you could win 10 championships in 12 years and not stress winning, and not, he was all, and I've heard this from so many people that I believe it, but it seems so hard to believe that he like almost never talked about winning. And it was always about the process and playing to your potential and practicing properly and doing the best you can. And if you do that over and over and over enough times, well, you will win, or you'll give yourself the opportunity to win. And, that's another principle that I've seen in other places too, but it's certainly one that he strongly believed in.
Yes. And, it's interesting because we do talk about that whole process versus outcome-based coaching and parenting. On Parenting Aces, it's kind of a big theme around here. And I think, to hear it applied in another sport by someone outside of tennis, hopefully helps stress the validity of it, the importance of it. And I think the more we can try to stay focused on the process versus the outcome, the better athletes we are going to turn out and the better human beings we're going to turn out.
Without question. I have this experience in tennis, but I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. My daughter has done rowing. She participates in crew, and the 2 boys chose baseball. And certainly in baseball, I see this analogy. You can hit the pitch the right way. You can see the pitch. You can take a solid swing. You can hit it really hard, and the shortstop jumps high in the air and catches it, and you're out. And so sometimes the batter walks back in frustration. But again, if you take that, if you swing at the proper pitch enough times, if you hit it with that kind of velocity enough times, that's all part of the process. You've got to believe that you're going to get enough times where that ball's going to go over the shortstop's head and he can't catch it, or it's going to fall into a gap. So that's, it's again a process versus an outcome. And with tennis, certainly you could serve the ball right where you want it, or you can hit the ball, it lands an inch from the baseline, and you could have done everything right technique wise. You could have followed it up to the net or whatever. You could have followed the game plan. But if that player across the net comes up with some amazing lob and you're caught frozen at the net and there it goes over your head, again, you got to believe that if you hit the ball the way you did in that instance over and over and over again, you're going to win your points and your games and your sets and so on.
Right. I had a coach tell me, actually, as part of my women's team, that sometimes you just have to say, "Nice shot, ma'am."
Absolutely.
Sometimes you've done everything right, like you said. You've created the opening, you've gotten the shot you want, you've executed your shot, and by some miracle, the person on the other side of the net not only tracks it down, but responds with an even better shot and wins the point. And as frustrating as that can be, if you are focused, as you're saying, on the process as opposed to the outcome of that particular point, it gives you the freedom to say, "Nice shot, ma'am," and move on to the next point, because you've put in the work, you're going to get the opportunity again and again and again, and the person on the other side of the net hopefully isn't going to be able to come up with that winning shot again and again and again. But if they are, okay, there's another match on another day. And this is one of the reasons I love Rafael Nadal so much, is to be in the interview room with him after a loss is unbelievable. The guy, he is one of the best that I've ever seen at being able to say, "You know what? Today wasn't my day. The guy on the other side of the net played better. There'll be another match tomorrow." And he just doesn't get bogged down in wins and losses. And it's fascinating to me.
I agree. Absolutely. He doesn't get bogged down in it, yet he's one of the winningest players you'll ever find, right? So it's
exactly.
It's great. Yeah.
So it works.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. It sure does.
Yeah. Talk about some of the other coaches that you studied and some of the lessons that you've learned from them.
Here's one that Nick Bollettieri, to use a tennis example. So I did a bit of reading and talked to some people who have some firsthand experience with him. And, one of the things that came was very clear was his passion and his energy. So that's something, again, that can translate to any sport and any age. But if you occasionally you'll see a coach who has high expectations and expects their players to be very enthused and to be very passionate and very energetic and very positive, yet they don't always model that. So, I certainly believe that a high level of passion and energy and enthusiasm is infectious. It sets a good example, and people feed off it positively. And that's a lesson that can be taken from Nick Bollettieri, other coaches too, but he's the one I cite and kind of look at a little closer as far as that attribute goes. So that's something that could be learned. There's another lesson that I think is very important too. Coaches being the instructors, the educators, and the experts. Sometimes you'll see coaches who kind of go on a little bit too long and maybe like to hear themselves talk a little bit. Or sometimes they come up with these super, super intricate plays or strategies. But there's a coach that is well known and an all-time great coach, Vince Lombardi, who is won the first two Super Bowls as the head coach of the NFL Green Bay Packers. And he's an example of somebody I have in the book that he's from a different time. So 50, 60 years ago, they did things a little bit differently, and it was harsher and sometimes brutal and tough. So he'd have to modify his ways if he were to coach in today's world. But one of the things he did that was appropriate then and is appropriate now was he advocated keeping things as simple as they could be. So he was known for a pretty small playbook, and they just did the same thing over and over. And he almost felt that if he made things too many layers upon layers on a certain strategy, or while he was giving instruction, it just it increased the chance that his players would do things the wrong way. So, there's something to be learned there too. Game plans or strategies can become a little more complicated, but the lesson from him is keep things as simple as you can. Keep them as simple as possible, instructions as simple as possible, and don't, for the sake of sounding smarter or just for the sake of it, make things more complicated than they need to be. And sometimes,
I think that's great advice.
Yeah, and look, there's a lot to tennis strategy, but sometimes you can just go out there and tell somebody, hey, the bottom line is hit the ball over the net one more time than your opponent. And
exactly.
It's not as easy as it is to say, but it's not as easy to do as it is to say. But sometimes you boil things down to the simplest way you could put it.
Absolutely. Well, of all the coaches that you looked at, if you could pick one that, as a coach yourself, you would model yourself after, who would that be and why?
I would have to say Pete Carroll, who is the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, and I'm going to also, this may not sound like great news to you, but he was the coach at USC, as you may know, and he is one of the.
Okay, wait. So let me just say, my daughter, my oldest daughter, is a Trojan.
Oh.
She was at USC when Pete was the football coach there, and she in her whole life never could have cared one iota about sports of any kind, but especially football. She thought it was the dumbest thing ever. And when she got to USC, she became the most avid Trojan football fan you have ever seen. She knew every stat of every player, of every game. She knew everything there was to know about Coach Pete Carroll. And to this day, she's been out of college several years now. She lives in Los Angeles, and she goes to almost every home game and even travels to some of the away games.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I will tell you, we were a house divided when she was in college. It was a little tough, but it was hard not to get caught up in her enthusiasm for Pete and that Trojan team. So, I became a fan, I have to say.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes. So he, coach of the NFL Seahawks, has won a Super Bowl. When he was at USC, they won a national championship. Do you happen to know what his favorite book is?
I do not. Oh, The Inner Game of Tennis. I do know that.
Absolutely. Yes. Isn't that something? So
I don't know how I know that, but I just pulled that out of somewhere.
Well, you knew it. You were right. He does talk about it, though. So he, he's a coach that I do think highly of. So he came of age in the 1970s, and he kind of studied Maslow and Maslow's theory, hierarchy of needs, and the psychological needs and all that stuff before you need to have certain needs first before you could go up the ladder and fulfill your potential. So he was very much a fan of the positive psychology movement at the time, and he tells the stories in the 1970s in the world of football that really wasn't espoused. So he it was all this new age gobbledygook, according to some people and the old school football coaches. But he tried to find his way to impart some of that into his coaching when he was a young assistant coach. And, he moved up the ladder, gradually, eventually became a head coach. He's an interesting story too, because failed might be a strong word, but he was fired twice. Once as the head coach of the New York Jets and once as the head coach of the New England Patriots. And then after a year or two off, he gets the job at USC, and the rest is history. As we noted, he won a championship there, and then with the Seahawks. But he kind of really formalized a philosophy. So he had a philosophy of coaching, and he did that in the interim between being fired from those jobs and re-entering the coaching world. So he kind of fine-tuned his vision and his way of doing things, and what he wanted to impart and how he wanted to coach, which is a lesson. Again, that's a good lesson for coaches of any sport. But, I like him because he does have a way of keeping people accountable, yet keeping things fun. As you just said, that was a great story. He He inspired people who had no interest in football in coming to their games and becoming football fans. So he really has done a lot of good things. Be in the present. He's another person who, in all sports, a lot of sports, somebody messes up. A lot of times they're used to walking to the sideline or during the next break or timeout, getting chewed out. But he very much was opposed to that method. He's okay. Somebody drops an easy pass. When they come to the sideline, we're going to talk to them. We're going to teach them. We're going to tell them where they went wrong and how they can do better next time. And in a way that they will be listening and in a way that they're not insulted or intimidated or belittled. So, I'm a fan of his.
That's awesome. And so as a tennis coach, how do you take those lessons and implement them with the kids and the adults that you work with?
Yeah, so it's the other thing, this is tied into Pete Carroll too. So this is something important, and I do work with students I teach to be in the present. So that point that you just lost or that you messed up on is done. You cannot do anything about it. You cannot go back in time. Now, you can learn from it and maybe do things a little bit differently, but you have to be of the mindset that next point is the most important point. You can't go back in time. That mistake that you made or whatever misfortune you had on that last point or last series of points cannot infect the next series of points or the next point. You have to be able to clear your mind in quick fashion, maybe take a little lesson from it, but reset and be ready because that next point is the most important point.
Right. And so how do you teach your students that lesson? Because to me, that's one of the hardest things about our sport is we don't have a coach out there with us to say just that, that point's in the past, move on. This next point's the most important one. We have to be groomed as tennis players to be able to recall that information and tell it to ourselves quickly, in the 20 seconds in between points.
Yeah, process it and do it quickly. So it is very tough, but we do it in our clinics, in our when we do match play, that portion of the lesson or the clinic, that's kind of when we do it. And that's when we do the coaching, and it's after the point, and it's not an official match of any sort. So we do have a lot more freedom to do that. Just walk up on the court and explain, hey, did you see what happened there? And kind of use it as a teaching moment. So the best thing I think you could do is try to train players to recognize that on their own, because they're going to have to, right? So, if some of those strategic lessons and some of those mental game type of lessons on how to let the past go, how to refocus, the visualization, there are a few things there we work on that, it is up to that individual to absorb it and to learn it and to be able to apply it independently. That's certainly true. So that does make our sport a little different, a little tougher.
Yeah, and I think, as a coach, there's a big challenge there, because when your player goes into a competitive situation, whether it's a high school match, a college match, college is a little bit different because they are allowed to have coaching, but, tournament play, you are hoping and trusting that player has learned enough of the lessons that you've tried to teach them to find success on the competition court, right? And I think that's so tough. And I think that's one of the things that's so hard for us as parents too, is having that trust in our kid when they go out onto that competitive court, that they can remember and recall these important lessons that they've been learning all along the way. And it's very tough.
Yeah, it is very tough. And I don't have a simple answer to that, but that is a big challenge for our sport. And that's one of the reasons, one of the reasons it's unique, right? It makes it a little bit unique and a little different. The dynamic in college and high school tennis is a little different, and it allows for that, for a coach to interject more. But in tournament play, it's that's why it's such a mentally tough sport, right?
Sure. Did any of the coaches that you researched, did you come across any advice or information on how they interacted or dealt with parents of players?
Yeah, not so much in this book. That's a minefield in itself, I think. Right?
Now, what are you saying? What are you saying?
So I could talk a little bit about that, my experiences as a sports parent, and then also as an athletic director and as a coach. It's tough. I've had coaches, popular stances for coaches to say I don't talk to parents, I don't deal with parents. But I don't know. I think that's a little bit harsh. I do agree that you should teach your child to advocate for themselves, or if there's a concern to at the appropriate time, teach them how and when to approach the coach and to express their concerns. I do believe that's an initial step, that's for sure. But yeah, there's some high school coaches I've worked with who just very firmly would say I don't talk to parents, but the athletes are minors at that age, and they're at an age where parents still have to sign notes when they're sick and still have to sign papers when they get a bad grade or a good grade, or still called in for parent-teacher conferences. So I think that—
Or write a check.
Yeah, write a check. Absolutely. And I've heard that too from college coaches, and that's interesting too, because but you expect the tuition money, and you expect all this kind of support, but you won't take a phone call from a parent. And I always thought that was a little bit harsh. As a parent, I think you've got to respect the coach, and there's a time and a place and a way to do it. Like I've always, as an athletic director, when I would talk to parents, the moment the game ends is not the time to rush after the coach and express your anger or your concerns. So I do have some experience kind of talking to parents about how and when and the right time. And then conversely too, I've never thought the right stance for a coach was to say, I don't talk to parents. I think it's a little silly.
How did you handle that when you were coaching at the college level?
I got to tell you, when I was coaching at the college level, I had pretty good relationships with parents. It was good. I had supportive parents. I would talk to them before the matches and some informal times, maybe with, after practice sometimes, but they weren't that involved. I had a lot of good fortune in that way. Like I never had somebody I felt was looking over my shoulder or was trying to analyze who was playing what position. Like I never really can say I had that experience as a college tennis coach. I have had, in more of the private setting, parents ask questions about which court or which group their child was in, and kind of try to push you a little bit on that, press you on that situation that they always think their child's better and should be on another court or should be challenged more. Like those conversations I've had. But as a college coach, I really can't say I've had any bad experiences. As an athletic director, I've had to work with coaches and parents through some situations as an athletic director. That I have had. And again, it's go ahead, yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it was typically conversation with parents that it was give it 24 hours, call the coach, give them the number, at a time when you're both hopefully level-headed, you could talk through the situation and hopefully take steps that'll resolve the issue or get everyone in a better place. There are parents. I've had parents. I've been at the side of a baseball field when my son is playing and his peers are playing baseball, and I had a parent come to me and didn't like the way the coach spoke to the players, and I had a parent come to me, and this was in my role as a parent. But the other parent, knowing my experiences, came up to me and said, "Chris, give me one reason why I shouldn't march up to that coach after the game and give him a piece of my mind." And the way the coach coached, I didn't blame him for thinking that way and possibly taking that approach. And I asked him a couple of questions, and at some point I did ask him. I said, "Well, I used his son's name was not Tom, but I used let's use that." So it's Tom. I said, "Well, would Tom
Okay.
want you to do that? Would Tom want you to do that, or how would he feel if you did that?" He's like, "Oh, no, he'd be mortified." So I said, "Well, I think that's a big part of your answer. If your child's gonna be mortified and it's the last thing he wants you to do, I don't think the right approach would be to aggressively confront the coach right after the game with parents, with your child around, and with his peers around." And then, yeah, I did talk to him a little bit about a better way to do it.
And so, how much of your coaching philosophy and approach now is a result of all of this research that you've done?
I certainly, have learned to a few things, and I think I did this to an extent when I was younger, but certainly focusing a little more on the process as opposed to the outcome. I'm definitely more leaning in favor of the process, and some of the ideas we talked about earlier. So emphasizing the process over the outcome, that is definitely a stronger advocate of that now than I was maybe when I was younger. Um, Getting out of the routine is another concept that I've learned through my research. So I think there's a value to having very well planned out practices and having logical progressions and a total kind of a system that you're implementing. And again, routines are very good for athletes. They understand and kind of can see what's coming next, and that's kind of good, and it's good for a lot of reasons. But there are times I think you throw out the game plan, or not the game plan, but the practice plan. I think that there's a value to that. There's a value to asking you could manage the choices. You can kind of manipulate the choices, but you could give the students or the athletes options. Okay, we're going to do 1, 2, 3, and 4. What order are we going to do it in today? Or, so it's not, so they have some say into it. And, that getting out of a routine sometimes relieves some stress. It makes things a little more fun. It breaks up like a, I don't want to say drudgery, but just the same old thing type of mentality. So that's something too that I believe in. And also
Yeah, I
another
think those
one.
are both good.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, no, thank you. Another one I learned, and not that I didn't believe this before, but it's higher on my radar now. Is culture precedes championships. So that's something I've read in a few places. But if you want to win, if you want to perform at a high level, if you want to be perceived in a certain way, then that's going to come, or that might come. But there are things you do. You act that way. You talk that way. You dress that way. You have work habits. That hopefully will lead to that. So there's a cultural shift sometimes, or a mindset shift that has to happen that can enable championships or higher performance.
Did you find when you were researching all these coaches that there were more differences or more similarities between male coaches and female coaches?
The ones I researched, I didn't find that many big differences, really. I think, Lisa, that we'll see, historically coaching has been dominated by men, right? And maybe it still is.
Yes.
But so that may change, or more evidence one way or the other may become more apparent as there are more successful coaches or more numbers of female coaches. But like two of the coaches I looked at, Billie Jean King, who's known as a player more than a coach, but she's coached individually various players. She consulted with Martina Navratilova. She's coached Fed Cup. She was another one, Pat Summitt, who is a basketball coach, coached for Tennessee women's basketball team for many, many years. And reading about those two in particular, there were similarities with men. Like they did some of the same things, for better or worse, as their male counterparts did.
Interesting. There's a lot of kind of momentum behind women in the coaching world of tennis, and And I think that's a really positive thing. As a woman, as a parent of two women, I'm always a big advocate of more opportunities and equal opportunities, I should say, for men and women out there. And so I was very happy to see that you didn't only interview or research male coaches, but you also studied some female coaches as well. And I think that's really important. And, especially for those of us raising daughters, I think we want them to have strong female role models out there. And for our daughters who play sports, having female coaches who are effective and, are well trained and know how to win, but also know how to develop athletes and good humans is crucial. And, so I'm very happy that your book isn't only focused on the males.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And I definitely wanted to do that. As I'm sitting here also thinking, when I played tennis in college, I had 3 different coaches. They moved in and out quickly, but I had 3 coaches in 4 years. But for 2 of those years, it was a female. And I don't think ever, I certainly do this and I didn't do this. And I don't remember ever on the bus, on the trips, at the practices, people saying, oh, what does she know? She's a woman. I never saw that attitude. I never had that attitude. If we ever were resistant, it was because we thought it was a bad idea, not because it was coming from a female. Like I never heard that, never.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah. And I'm sure it happens in some places, but I didn't think that, and I didn't, I never had the mindset I'm not going to try that strategy, or what is she? Because a woman told me that strategy. I would not think that.
Mm-hmm. That's good to hear. I mean, she was obviously hired because she knew her stuff, and people look beyond gender, and that's a really good thing. And I think we need to keep kind of pushing that message.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not a gender issue whether or not you're an effective coach. It's whether or not you've done your homework, whether or not you've studied the sport, whether or not you've surrounded yourself with good teachers and good mentors, and that can be accomplished by men and by women equally. And I think, it's interesting to kind of start to see like the whole Amelie Mauresmo coaching Andy Murray situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's awesome, to see a female coaching a top male professional. And I think that is opening the door to a lot more women getting into coaching. And I think it's a great field for women. So I hope more follow in her footsteps. I wanted just before we close, before we close, because we're coming to the end of our hour, I wanted to just ask you, if a parent were interested in picking up your book, which hopefully everyone listening to this podcast will be, picking up your book, 14 Great Coaches, what lessons are there in there for the parent?
That's a great question.
You're a sports parent too. You're
right.
So yeah.
So let me put it this way. So there's 60 kind of insights and lessons and concepts, as I mentioned before. So these are things that apply to coaching, but many of them apply to parenting. They apply to teaching. They can even apply to the business world. So if I'm a parent, I have no interest in coaching maybe, but I have an athlete in my house or a young person who's interested in learning how to play sports. So I would buy the book. I would pick up the book because it helps coaches become better coaches, but it also helps parents identify good coaching and identify maybe poor coaching. So besides, as I said before, some of these are human relations principles that'll apply in the house as well. But that's one too, so if you see some of these things, if you see, a coach out there who's complicating things, as you're waiting to pick up your child or as you're watching from the sideline, or if you see a coach who's just has that overbearing, intimidated presence without any of the positive attributes to counterbalance that, that might be something that you see, hey, wait, I gotta look closer at this, or maybe this coach isn't the best coach. If you see the coach has practices and that's the same old thing every single time. So but you read my book about getting out of a routine or making things fun. So you read that in the book, but you don't see that. That's something that can help you, again, identify a good coach or a bad coach, or a good coaching environment or playing environment. So those are some of the things you can pick up from the book. There's another one. I'll mention this one too, that it applies to the field, to the home, to the classroom, whatever. But have you ever heard of the positivity ratio? There's some research done. Okay. So and it's cited in the book, and the sources are in there, in the back of the book, but there's a ratio, the ideal positive to negative ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions is 5-1. So there's research that says the highest performing teams, or the ideal learning environment, is 5 positive to 1 negative. And so that's something I've also seen echoed by somebody like Phil Jackson, who coached the Chicago Bulls at the highest levels, the NBA and the Lakers. Joe Madden, manager of the Chicago Cubs. So if I'm watching a practice, and as you get closer to 1-1, 3-1, the research shows that that's less than ideal, that they're mediocre performing or lower performing teams. And then inversely, the lowest performing teams had a ratio of like 9-1 negative to positive interaction. So that's something, as a parent, you can watch for in your child's athletic experiences. And 5-1 is very tough. It's very tough. If you ever try to monitor that, so maybe 3-1 is more realistic, but whatever, you find a baseline and you try to get closer to 5-1, then maybe if you're at 2-1 right now, that you start with where you are. But, and then interestingly enough, there is something that's too positive. So if you're in an environment, a team environment or athletic environment, 1-1, if I'm coaching an athlete on the tennis court and the ratio is like 15-1, 20-1, well, something may not be right there. Like maybe some of the tough conversations are being avoided, or maybe some of the constructive criticism, or maybe some reprimands even are not being implemented when they should be. So that's a ratio that is something to keep in mind. And again, a parent can kind of keep an eye on that. Especially, if you have a coach who has really no formal background in coaching or teaching, or doesn't have a lot of really that much experience working with kids, they may be doing some things the way they learned it 30 years ago, which was definitely a different time, and things were done differently, and things may have been accepted back then that aren't accepted now. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your new book with us, and this honor of being chosen as one of Changing the Game Project Books of 2017. I think it's just, that's just awesome, and congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thanks again, Lisa. It's awesome to be on the show. Like I said, I'm a fan of the show, and it's been great talking to you. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. And to my listeners, we will have links to Chris's website and a direct link to purchase his book in the show notes. So be sure and check those out. And Chris, I hope you'll come back on the show, and as your book gains momentum out there and you start to get more and more feedback, and maybe you decide to do a second book, that you'll keep us in mind and come share with us again.
Absolutely. Lisa, we'll do that. And I do have some ideas percolating. So there's going to be a second book at some point. And so I appreciate that. And Lisa, you keep up the great work too.
Thanks so much. To my listeners, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Parenting Aces.
I'm Lisa Stone, and you've been listening to the Parenting Aces podcast. For tennis parents, by a tennis parent. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to us and write a review on iTunes. For more information on navigating the junior and college tennis journey, please visit us online at parentingaces.com. Thanks for tuning in and sharing us with your tennis community.